Hello, Patreon backers. So we've got another Patrons Ask GN episode. This will be a pretty quick one as usual. Leave your questions on the Discord in the Ask GN section, and hopefully it'll either be in this one or one of the main episodes on the main channel. First one is from Unilythe, who says, in cases without fan slots in the back, like the Lian Li PC-O11 Air, would the cooling performance be better if you point the air cooler upwards with an outtake fan right above it? The PC-O11 Air has fan slots at the top, so I assume the temperature would be better if you make use of that by pointing the cooler up as well. This is a tough question, actually, because adding a fan to the top changes the entire dynamic of the case. It's possible that adding a fan to the top, as we showed, I think, with that exact case, can pull air away from the GPU in a way that's hurtful, because it might, if you have intake coming in and you suddenly add a pressure system up top that pulls air out, now your intake is going to naturally draft up. So you've got a tower cooler pulling air up and you have another fan pulling air up. The GPU might not be able to combat that. So let's just pretend, for sake of this question, that there's no concern about the GPU's temperature changing, you've got it under control, or you don't have one, whatever. So ignoring the video card in this scenario, if you orient, actually we can't still, I'll tell you why in a second. If you orient the cooler horizontally so that it's pulling air in sort of at the bottom and pushing it up, the next concern is what's your gap between the video card and the cooler? Because if it's like a 1-inch gap, you might be losing more pressure just by doing that 90-degree turn and forcing it between a wall and therefore lowering the cooling ability. You might be lowering it more than the benefit you would have from an extra fan on the top. The O11 Air does have a unique issue where hot air can kind of collect in that top corner of the case. So in that very specific case, your approach to this might be better. I would have to test it. Every single case is different. Every fan configuration, every case has specific behaviors. So there's no blanket answer to this question. I would assume that because of how this case is kind of choked at the back for exhaust, if you don't have like a video card that gets air out, like a blower fan, and basically like a squirrel cage fan pulling air out of the case, then, and you don't have a fan at the top or a fan at the rear, then it's going to be a problem where it collects and just kind of sits around the CPU and the CPU cooler. So your scenario would be helpful in that instance. Or you'd put an 80mm fan back there if you want and just do a traditional setup. But it'll depend on the gap between the video card and the CPU for the most part. So next one, Soupa says, you thoroughly reviewed and tore down the Enermax LiqTech 240 and 360 TR4 coolers last fall. Since then, I've seen quite a lot of reports of internal corrosion on these units. Check the LTT forums, Amazon reviews, etc. Has your unit been in use all this time? And if so, have you observed temperature increases or critical failures? We have not retested it, so I don't know how the temperatures are. We did take apart, I think I did open up one of those units. Yeah, so we did a teardown of one of those units. And then normally I don't restore the teardowns to function, but this one was restorable. So we just refilled it with distilled water. And there was actually a bit of corrosion in there around the screws for the fill port, or whatever I used for the fill port. So I guess it's potentially a problem. I never looked at the block, didn't take it apart that much, but I did look at the screws and there was some corrosion. So I would say, yeah, there's probably a problem there. I haven't opened it though to see how the block does, because that's the real concern, is does it get gunked up in the cold plate. So if it is that big of an issue, that's very unfortunate because it's a great cooler otherwise, and I'll see if I can get around to taking it apart again and see if it looks like it has corroded. We haven't had one in use the whole time. We have one on the stream machine, the rendering or the live stream machine. So that gets used every now and then, probably enough to have corrosion if there is any. But I'll look into it hopefully, I don't know, after we kind of get settled in the new place. ZDG says, when you move to the new office, have you considered getting a fake plant? And if so, have you and the team thought about what you will call the Ikea-Office-Plant? So this, we, in a move to counter hardware Canucks, we considered briefly, Andrew and I talked about getting a dead plant, because hardware Canucks they might want you to think that it's a real plant. It's actually a fake potted plant that Dimitri puts on top of all the cases when he reviews them. So just to reflect our style of coverage, I guess, a dead plant seems more suitable because it's dead like my soul from reviewing bad cases in 2017. TruckerNerd says, We have GDDR5X and 6 on the way, but system memory is still on DDR4. Is there a reason DDR5 and 6 are only used for graphics and not system memory? Is there a limitation of the memory modules, or is DDR4 just good enough and wouldn't make sense to use anything newer with current processors? First thing, the G in front of DDR is a really hard distinction. So GDDR5, it's not the same as DDR5 just with a G in front of it. They're actually different architectures. So DDR5 and 6, just your question where you say, is there a reason DDR5 and 6 are only used for graphics? DDR5 and 6 don't technically exist yet. I think there's a DDR5 test module out there somewhere. GDDR5 exists, and GDDR6 will exist for consumers very soon. So it's not the same thing. GDDR roughly doubles the bandwidth again over DDR, and it has a much lower heat flux. It requires lower voltages to hit a given frequency, a lower power overall, so lower just power consumption, lower current requirement, lower voltage. GDDR would do poorly for CPUs, just like DDR4 does poorly for GPUs, as you can see in our GT1030 DDR4 coverage. So they're made for different types of processors, RISC versus CISC, complex instructions in the latter case. So the architecture of the memory is different, and you really shouldn't, although you can, just swap the two. The only instance I can think of in very, very recent history is DDR4 on the GT1030, which obviously did not work out well. So yeah, they're not the same. DDR5 and 6 will come eventually. DDR5 is already in production. Well, it's in testing. GDDR6 is in production. So they'll be here, but the G is a really, really significant distinction between them. It's not the same architecture, and the companies shouldn't swap them, although every now and then they do. Last one, WiCK says, any news on the case fan testing rig? Looking forward to seeing the content whenever it's available. Me too. We have a couple questions out to an engineer who worked on helping us set the fan testing up. So once he answers those, and once we, again, at this point just move, I can start looking into it. There's not enough space right now. Every time I set it up to work on it, I have to tear it down. So at this point, it makes more sense just to wait another, I don't know, a little bit longer so that we can test it, and also I can get an engineering response on the questions I had. So that's it for this one. Thank you for supporting us on Patreon, and post your questions in Discord for next time. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.